bruises, lice, and a stepmom from hell, the police report that left a father speechless. It had been a year since Alex's mother, Sarah, had passed away from a sudden illness. The grief was still awake in his heart, a constant reminder of the void she had left in his life. He was 14, a freshman in high school, navigating the already turbulent waters of adolescence without the steady anchor of his mother's presence. His father, Robert, had struggled too. Sarah had been the center of their family, the glue that held them together. In the months following her death, Robert had withdrawn into himself, burying his grief in work and leaving Alex to fend for himself emotionally. Then, Susan entered their lives. She was a colleague of Robert's, a woman he'd known casually for years. She was attractive, outgoing, and seemed genuinely interested in Robert and Alex. She offered a comforting presence, a listening ear, and a helping hand. At first, Alex was wary. He resented the idea of anyone replacing his mother. He saw Susan as an intruder, a threat to the memory of the woman he had loved so dearly. But Susan was patient and persistent. She didn't try to force a relationship with Alex. She simply offered kindness, understanding, and a willingness to be there for him. She cooked his favorite meals, helped him with his homework, and listened patiently to his stories about his mother. Slowly, Alex began to warm up to her. He saw how much happier his father seemed, how much lighter the atmosphere in their house had become. He started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this new family could work. Robert and Susan got married 6 months after they started dating. It was a small, quiet ceremony, attended only by close family and friends. Alex, dressed in a suit that felt too big and too formal, stood beside his father, trying to smile, trying to feel happy for him. They moved into a new house, a larger, more modern home in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. It was a fresh start, a chance to build a new life together. But the idyllic facade of their new family life concealed a growing unease. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, that beneath Susan's cheerful exterior lay a hidden darkness. He couldn't articulate it, but it was there, a subtle sense of discomfort that he couldn't ignore. This first part sets the stage, introducing the main characters and the initial situation. It establishes the emotional backdrop of grief and loss, and the tentative beginnings of a new family dynamic. The subtle hint of unease at the end foreshadows the troubles to come. The first few months in the new house were relatively peaceful. Susan made an effort to be a good stepmother, cooking meals, helping Alex with his homework, and organizing family outings. She seemed genuinely interested in his life, asking about his friends, his classes, and his hobbies. But beneath the surface, there were subtle signs of tension. Susan had a way of controlling things, of subtly manipulating situations to her advantage. She was meticulous about the house, insisting on a level of cleanliness and order that Alex found stifling. She also seemed to resent any mention of Alex's mother. If Alex talked about Sarah, Susan would change the subject, or she would make a snide remark, suggesting that Alex was dwelling on the past. There were small acts of unkindness, too. Susan would forget to pack his lunch, or she would accidentally shrink his favorite shirt in the laundry. She would make promises she didn't keep, or she would criticize his friends, his appearance, or his performance in school. At first, Alex dismissed these incidents as minor annoyances. He told himself that Susan was just trying to adjust to her new role, that she was trying to establish her authority in the household. He didn't want to cause trouble, and he certainly didn't want to upset his father. But the incidents became more frequent, more pointed. Susan's criticisms became sharper, her tone more sarcastic. She started to isolate Alex, discouraging him from spending time with his friends or inviting them over to the house. She also started to control his access to his father. She would interrupt their conversations, she would make plans for the family that excluded Alex, and she would subtly undermine Alex's relationship with Robert. Alex started to feel like an outsider in his own home. He felt like he was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid Susan's disapproval. He started to withdraw, spending more time alone in his room, avoiding contact with his stepmother as much as possible. The early warning signs are subtle but significant. They establish a pattern of controlling and manipulative behavior on Susan's part, and they highlight Alex's growing discomfort and isolation. The focus is on the emotional and psychological aspects of the abuse, rather than physical violence, setting the stage for the escalation to come. The abuse escalated gradually, insidiously. It started with verbal abuse, a constant criticism, belittling remarks, and sarcastic comments. Susan would call Alex lazy, stupid, and worthless. She would compare him unfavorably to his deceased mother, saying things like, "Your mother would be so ashamed of you." The emotional manipulation intensified. Susan would play the victim, accusing Alex of being disrespectful, ungrateful, and disobedient. She would twist his words, distort his actions, and make him feel like he was constantly in the wrong. She also started to control his access to basic necessities. She would withhold food, telling him he hadn't earned it, or she would lock him out of the house if he was late coming home from school. She would monitor his phone calls, read his text messages, and restrict his internet access. The physical abuse started subtly. A shove, a pinch, a slap on the arm. At first, Alex tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was an accident, that Susan hadn't meant to hurt him. But the incidents became more frequent, more violent. The shoves became pushes, the pinches became hard grabs, the slaps became punches. Susan would often target areas of his body that were covered by clothing: his back, his stomach, his thighs, so the bruises wouldn't be visible. She would also use other forms of physical abuse, such as forcing him to stand in a corner for hours, depriving him of sleep, or locking him in his room without food or water. Alex lived in a constant state of fear. He never knew when Susan would snap, when her anger would erupt. He walked on eggshells, terrified of doing or saying anything that might provoke her. He became increasingly withdrawn, isolated, and depressed. He stopped talking to his friends, his grades plummeted, and he lost interest in the activities he used to enjoy. He felt trapped, helpless, and utterly alone. The escalation of the abuse is described in detail, but without being overly graphic or sensational. The focus is on the systematic nature of the abuse, the combination of verbal, emotional, and physical cruelty, and the devastating impact it has on Alex's well-being. As Alex's suffering intensified, the narrative shifts to explore Susan's backstory, seeking to understand, though not excuse, her abusive behavior. This is a crucial element for an elderly audience, who often appreciate understanding the motivations behind characters' actions. Susan's childhood had been marked by neglect and abuse. Her own mother had been an alcoholic, prone to violent outbursts and unpredictable behavior. Susan had grown up in a constant state of fear, never knowing when her mother would turn on her. She had learned to survive by being compliant, by anticipating her mother's moods, and by making herself invisible. She had also developed a deep-seated resentment towards children, seeing them as a burden and a source of endless frustration. Her first marriage had ended in divorce, her husband unable to cope with her controlling behavior and her emotional instability. She had no children of her own, and she secretly resented women who did. When she met Robert, she saw an opportunity for a new life, a chance to create the stable, loving family she had always craved. But her own unresolved trauma, her deep-seated insecurities, and her inability to regulate her emotions made it impossible for her to be the kind of wife and stepmother she aspired to be. Alex, a constant reminder of Robert's previous life and his deceased wife, became the target of her displaced anger and resentment. She saw him as an obstacle to her happiness, a threat to her control over Robert and their new family. Her abusive behavior was a twisted attempt to exert power, to control her environment, and to protect herself from the perceived threat that Alex represented. It was a cycle of abuse, repeating the patterns of her own childhood. This is not to excuse Susan's actions, but to provide context and understanding. Her backstory reveals the deep-seated psychological issues that fueled her abusive behavior, making her a more complex and, in a way, more tragic figure. Robert, caught up in his own grief and his newfound happiness with Susan, remained largely oblivious to the abuse. He worked long hours, often coming home late and exhausted. He trusted Susan implicitly, believing her to be a kind and caring woman. He saw the changes in Alex, his withdrawal, his declining grades, his sullen demeanor, but he attributed them to the lingering grief over his mother's death and the normal challenges of adolescence. Susan was adept at manipulating Robert, playing the role of the concerned stepmother, expressing her worries about Alex's behavior, and subtly shifting the blame onto him. She would tell Robert that Alex was disrespectful, disobedient, and ungrateful. She would paint a picture of Alex as a troubled and difficult child in need of discipline and control. Robert, wanting to believe the best in Susan and desperate to maintain the stability of his new family, accepted her explanations at face value. He didn't question her, he didn't investigate, and he didn't see the subtle signs of abuse that were right in front of him. He also, perhaps unconsciously, avoided confronting the possibility that Susan was capable of harming Alex. The thought was too painful, too disruptive to the fragile peace he had found in his new life. There were moments of doubt, fleeting instances where he saw a flicker of fear in Alex's eyes, or a bruise that Susan couldn't quite explain away. But he quickly dismissed these concerns, telling himself he was imagining things, that he was being overly sensitive. His blindness, or perhaps his willful denial, was a crucial factor in the continuation of the abuse. It allowed Susan to operate with impunity, to isolate Alex, and to maintain her control over the household. Robert's failure to protect his son, however unintentional, would become a source of profound guilt and regret later on. The exploration of Robert's perspective adds another layer of complexity to the story. His obliviousness or denial is not presented as malicious, but rather as a consequence of his own emotional state and Susan's manipulative behavior. Alex, despite his fear, made several attempts to seek help. He tried to confide in his best friend, Mark, but he couldn't bring himself to reveal the full extent of the abuse. He was ashamed, embarrassed, and afraid of what Mark might think. He also tried to talk to his homeroom teacher, Ms. Johnson. He hinted at problems at home, saying that he was having trouble sleeping and that he was feeling stressed. Ms. Johnson, a caring but overworked teacher, offered some general advice and encouraged him to talk to his father. He even considered calling Child Protective Services, but he was terrified of the consequences. He feared that Susan would retaliate, that his father would be angry, and that he would be taken away from his home. One day, he overheard a conversation between Susan and Robert. Susan was complaining about Alex, saying that he was lazy, disrespectful, and that he needed more discipline. Robert, his voice tired and strained, agreed. This conversation shattered Alex's last shred of hope. He realized that his father wouldn't believe him, that he was completely alone. He decided that he had to endure the abuse, that there was no way out. The failed attempts to seek help highlight Alex's isolation and his growing sense of hopelessness. They also underscore the challenges of reporting abuse, particularly when the abuser is a trusted figure and the victim is afraid of the consequences. As the abuse continued, Alex became increasingly isolated. He withdrew from his friends, stopped participating in extracurricular activities, and spent most of his time alone in his room. His grades plummeted. He couldn't concentrate in class, he couldn't focus on his homework, and he lost all interest in learning. He felt like he was living in a fog, his mind numb with fear and despair. He started to experience physical symptoms of stress, headaches, stomach aches, and insomnia. He lost his appetite, and he started to lose weight. He also developed a deep sense of shame and self-blame. He believed that he was somehow responsible for the abuse, that he was a bad person who deserved to be punished. Susan, sensing his vulnerability, tightened her grip. She increased her control over his life, monitoring his every move, isolating him from any potential sources of support. She forbade him from talking to his friends, she restricted his access to the phone and the internet, and she even started to accompany him to and from school. Alex felt like he was trapped in a prison, with no way out. He lost all hope of escaping the abuse, of ever being happy again. He began to contemplate suicide, seeing it as the only way to end his suffering. The increasing isolation is a key element of the abuse dynamic. It highlights the abuser's control and the victim's growing sense of helplessness and despair. The physical and emotional symptoms Alex experiences are realistic and portray the devastating impact of prolonged abuse. Just when Alex was at his lowest point, a glimmer of hope appeared. Robert's sister, Aunt Carol, different from the previous story, came to visit for a week. Carol was a warm, observant woman who had always been close to Alex. She immediately noticed the changes in him. She saw the sadness in his eyes, the fear in his posture, and the withdrawn way he interacted with Susan. She also noticed the bruises on his arms, which Susan tried to explain away as accidental injuries. Carol, a retired social worker, was not easily fooled. She had seen cases of child abuse before, and she recognized the warning signs. She started to ask Alex questions, gently probing him about his life at home, his relationship with Susan, and his overall well-being. Alex, initially hesitant, slowly began to open up to her. He didn't reveal the full extent of the abuse, but he hinted at his unhappiness, his fear, and his sense of isolation. Carol listened patiently, offering him unconditional love and support. She told him that he was a good person, that he didn't deserve to be treated badly, and that she would help him. She also started to observe Susan more closely, noticing her controlling behavior, her sharp tone with Alex, and her subtle put-downs. She saw the way Susan manipulated Robert, playing the role of the devoted wife while subtly undermining his relationship with his son. Carol's visit gave Alex a renewed sense of hope. He felt like he finally had someone on his side, someone who believed him, someone who might be able to help him escape the abuse. The introduction of Aunt Carol provides a turning point in the story. She represents a potential ally for Alex, someone who recognizes the signs of abuse and is willing to intervene. Her presence creates a sense of hope, but also raises the stakes, as the conflict between her and Susan is likely to escalate. The incident that finally led to the reveal happened during Aunt Carol's visit. Susan had been particularly irritable that day, her mood exacerbated by Carol's presence and her subtle questioning. Alex had accidentally spilled a glass of milk at the dinner table. It was a minor accident, but Susan reacted with disproportionate anger. She screamed at him, calling him clumsy and stupid. She then grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh, and dragged him to his room. Aunt Carol, witnessing this outburst, was horrified. She tried to intervene, but Susan pushed her aside, telling her to mind her own business. Later that evening, after Susan and Robert had gone to bed, Carol went to check on Alex. She found him huddled in his bed, his body shaking with sobs. He had fresh bruises on his arm, where Susan had grabbed him. Carol, her heart aching for her nephew, held him close, comforting him. She asked him to tell her everything, promising that she would protect him. Alex, his voice trembling, finally confessed the full extent of the abuse. He told Carol about the verbal abuse, the emotional manipulation, the physical violence, and the constant fear he lived in. Carol listened in stunned silence, her anger and disbelief growing with each revelation. She realized that Alex had been living in a nightmare, a silent hell that she had only glimpsed the surface of. The incident, while not described in graphic detail, is a pivotal moment. It is the culmination of the escalating abuse, and it provides the concrete evidence that Carol needs to take action. The emotional impact on Alex and Carol is the focus, highlighting the severity of the situation. Carol knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't leave Alex in that house, vulnerable to further abuse. She decided to call the police. She waited until Robert and Susan were asleep. Then she snuck into the kitchen and dialed 911. She spoke in a low voice, explaining the situation, describing the abuse, and requesting immediate assistance. The police arrived quickly and quietly, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet suburban neighborhood. Carol led them to Alex's room, where he was still awake, his eyes wide with fear. The officers, trained in handling cases of child abuse, spoke to Alex gently, reassuring him that he was safe. They examined his bruises, documented his injuries, and took his statement. They then woke up Robert and Susan, informing them of the allegations and their intention to take Alex into protective custody. Susan, initially defiant, denied everything. She claimed that Alex was lying, that he was a troubled child who made up stories. She tried to portray herself as the victim, claiming that Carol was interfering in their family and trying to turn Robert against her. Robert, stunned and confused, didn't know what to believe. He looked from Susan to Alex, his mind reeling. He had never suspected that Susan was capable of such cruelty. He had trusted her, he had loved her, and now he was faced with the horrifying possibility that she had been abusing his son. The police, however, had enough evidence to proceed. They had Alex's statement, Carol's testimony, and the visible bruises on Alex's body. They placed Susan under arrest, charging her with child abuse and assault. The reveal is a dramatic and emotional scene. The arrival of the police, Susan's denial, and Robert's shock create a powerful sense of tension and uncertainty. The focus is on the immediate consequences of the abuse being exposed and the beginning of the legal process. The police investigation was thorough and meticulous. They interviewed Alex multiple times, carefully documenting his account of the abuse. They also interviewed Robert, Carol, neighbors, teachers, and anyone who might have had contact with the family. A child psychologist, Dr. Ramirez, was brought in to evaluate Alex. Dr. Ramirez confirmed that Alex was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) as a result of the prolonged abuse. He exhibited classic symptoms, including anxiety, depression, nightmares, flashbacks, and difficulty concentrating. The physical evidence was also compelling. The police photographed Alex's bruises, documented his injuries, and collected medical records. They also searched the house, finding evidence that corroborated Alex's story, such as locks on the outside of his bedroom door and restrictions on his phone and computer usage. Susan, initially defiant, continued to deny the allegations. She claimed that Alex was a troubled child, prone to lying and exaggeration. She insisted that the bruises were accidental, the result of his clumsiness or his own self-harming behavior. Robert, initially in shock and disbelief, gradually began to accept the reality of the situation. He reviewed his own memories, recalling incidents that he had dismissed or explained away at the time. He realized that he had been blind to the abuse, that he had failed to protect his son. The guilt was overwhelming. The investigation also uncovered Susan's history of abusive behavior. They contacted her ex-husband, who confirmed that she had been controlling and emotionally abusive during their marriage. They also found records of complaints filed against her by neighbors in her previous residences. The investigation highlights the meticulous process of gathering evidence in a child abuse case. It emphasizes the importance of expert testimony, physical evidence, and corroborating information in building a strong case. Robert's gradual realization of the truth is a crucial element, highlighting the devastating impact of his denial. With the evidence mounting against her, Susan's defense began to crumble. Her lawyer advised her to cooperate with the police, but she remained defiant, clinging to her claims of innocence. The police presented her with the overwhelming evidence: Alex's testimony, Carol's observations, Dr. Ramirez's evaluation, the physical evidence, and her own history of abusive behavior. Faced with the undeniable truth, Susan finally broke down. She confessed to the abuse, admitting that she had verbally, emotionally, and physically harmed Alex. She claimed that she hadn't meant to hurt him, that she had been under a lot of stress, and that she had lost control. Her confession, however, was not a full admission of guilt. She still tried to minimize her actions, to shift some of the blame onto Alex, and to portray herself as a victim of her own troubled past. Despite her attempts to mitigate her responsibility, the police had enough evidence to charge her with multiple counts of child abuse and assault. She was formally arrested and taken into custody. Robert, devastated by the betrayal and heartbroken by the suffering his son had endured, filed for divorce. He vowed to do everything in his power to protect Alex and to help him heal. The confrontation and arrest scene provides a sense of justice and closure, but it also highlights the complexities of the situation. Susan's confession is not a complete redemption, and Robert's pain and guilt remain. After Susan's arrest, Alex was placed in the temporary care of Aunt Carol. Carol's home became a safe haven, a place where he could begin to heal from the trauma he had endured. Carol provided him with unconditional love, support, and understanding. She listened to his fears, comforted his nightmares, and encouraged him to express his feelings. She created a stable and nurturing environment where he could feel safe and secure. Child Protective Services (CPS) became involved, conducting their own investigation and assessing Alex's needs. They determined that it was in Alex's best interest to remain with Carol, at least temporarily, while Robert underwent counseling and demonstrated his ability to provide a safe and supportive home. Robert, devastated by his own failures, cooperated fully with CPS. He attended parenting classes, underwent individual therapy, and worked to create a safe and welcoming environment for Alex in his own home. Alex, while relieved to be away from Susan, struggled with mixed emotions. He missed his father, but he was also afraid of returning to the house where the abuse had occurred. He trusted Carol, but he also longed for the stability of a permanent home. The placement with Aunt Carol represents a crucial step in Alex's recovery. It provides him with a safe and supportive environment, free from abuse and fear. The involvement of CPS highlights the systemic response to child abuse and the importance of ensuring the child's well-being. Alex began intensive therapy with Dr. Ramirez, working to process the trauma he had experienced. The therapy sessions were difficult and painful, forcing him to confront the memories and emotions he had tried to suppress. He learned to identify and express his feelings, his anger, his sadness, his fear, his shame, and his guilt. He learned coping mechanisms to manage his anxiety and his flashbacks. He learned to challenge the negative beliefs he had internalized about himself, the beliefs that he was somehow responsible for the abuse. Dr. Ramirez used a variety of therapeutic techniques, including cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT), trauma-focused therapy, and art therapy. He helped Alex to understand that the abuse was not his fault, that he was a victim, and that he deserved to be safe and loved. The therapy was a long and slow process, with setbacks and breakthroughs. There were days when Alex felt overwhelmed by his emotions, when he wanted to give up. But with Dr. Ramirez's support and Carol's unwavering love, he persevered. He gradually began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the flashbacks less intense. He started to sleep better, to eat better, and to regain his sense of self-worth. He started to reconnect with his friends, to return to school, and to rediscover the joys of being a teenager. The therapy and healing section highlights the long and challenging process of recovery from trauma. It emphasizes the importance of professional help, the use of various therapeutic techniques, and the unwavering support of loved ones. The legal proceedings against Susan were lengthy and complex. She initially pleaded not guilty, forcing the case to go to trial. Alex, though terrified of facing his abuser in court, was determined to testify. He wanted to tell his story, to hold Susan accountable for her actions, and to ensure that she couldn't hurt anyone else. The trial was a grueling experience for Alex. He had to recount the details of the abuse in front of a jury, a judge, and Susan herself. He had to endure cross-examination by Susan's lawyer, who tried to discredit his testimony and portray him as a liar. But Alex, with the support of Dr. Ramirez, Carol, and the prosecutor, persevered. He told his story clearly and convincingly, his voice trembling but his resolve unwavering. The jury, after deliberating for several hours, found Susan guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to a significant prison term, a sentence that reflected the severity of her crimes. The legal proceedings provide a sense of justice and closure, but they also highlight the challenges of prosecuting child abuse cases. Alex's courage in testifying is a testament to his strength and resilience. Robert, throughout the legal proceedings and Alex's therapy, underwent his own process of reckoning. He had to confront his own failures as a father, his blindness to the abuse, and his complicity in allowing it to continue. He realized that he had been so focused on his own grief and his own happiness that he had neglected his son's needs. He had trusted Susan implicitly, ignoring the warning signs and dismissing Alex's subtle pleas for help. The guilt was overwhelming, a constant reminder of his failure to protect his child. He struggled with feelings of shame, anger, and self-blame. He sought therapy for himself, working to understand his own emotional baggage and to learn how to be a better father. He apologized to Alex, repeatedly, expressing his remorse and his commitment to making amends. He also worked to rebuild his relationship with Alex, slowly and patiently. He listened to his son's concerns, validated his feelings, and made a conscious effort to be present and supportive. Robert's reckoning is a crucial element of the story. It highlights the responsibility of parents to protect their children and the devastating consequences of failing to do so. His journey towards redemption is a slow and difficult one, but it is essential for Alex's healing. After Susan's sentencing, Alex made the difficult decision to return home to live with his father. He still had mixed emotions about returning to the house where the abuse had occurred, but he also longed for the familiarity and the connection with his father. Robert had made significant changes to the house, redecorating Alex's room, removing any reminders of Susan, and creating a safe and welcoming environment. He had also established clear boundaries and expectations, ensuring that Alex felt secure and respected. Alex and Robert began to rebuild their relationship, slowly and cautiously. They spent more time together talking, playing games, and sharing meals. They started to create new memories, positive experiences that would help to erase the painful ones of the past. Alex continued his therapy, working through his remaining trauma and developing healthy coping mechanisms. He also found support in a group for survivors of child abuse, connecting with other young people who had shared similar experiences. He gradually regained his confidence, his sense of self-worth, and his hope for the future. He returned to school, excelled in his studies, and rediscovered his passion for sports. The new beginning represents a hopeful conclusion to the story. It highlights Alex's resilience, his ability to heal, and the power of a supportive father-son relationship. It also emphasizes the importance of ongoing therapy and support for survivors of abuse. The new beginning is not a perfect ending, but it is a realistic and optimistic one, acknowledging the ongoing challenges while celebrating the progress made. The story should show the process how they rebuild the relationship.